project, we're going to be focusing on the learning outcome S4. And this learning outcome says to explain the influence of culture on behavior and cognition. So the concept for this would be defining what culture is specifically, which is a set of ideas, behaviors, attitudes, and traditions that exist within a large group of people. And these ideas, behavior, and traditions are passed through generations, and typically they stay consistent over time. And this large culture, they have certain personality traits that lead to the behavior and the way that they think. Specific countries there's various countries that they fall under two specific types of culture, which is collectivist and individualist. Collectivist cultures emphasize the goals of the group and to keep the group harmony, versus individualist cultures, which focus on individualism and the goals for each individual and try to grow themselves individually. A main influence of culture on behavior can be conformity, which conformity is an individual following the same sets of rules as another person. And in collectivist cultures, there's a high emphasis on conformity because they want to keep the group harmony and keep the peace, rather than in individualist cultures. There's lower rates of conformity because the individuals don't care about keeping the specific peace and they care about themselves. A continuation of the concept is that the way that people think is also influenced by culture, such as the types of biases. An example would be self-serving bias, which is people, when they have positive outcomes, they say it was their fault that they had these positive outcomes, and they're more individual. Rather than when they have these negative outcomes, they blame the external factors. In the modesty bias, which is the second type of bias, it's the opposite. When an individual has success, they attribute the external factors to these success rather than internal factors. When there's sort of failure, they attribute themselves to this failure rather than other people. Modesty bias is really prominent among collectivist cultures because when there's success, they like to reward the whole group as a whole rather than one specific person, which is what occurs in the individualist, where when there's success, they attribute themselves to the success. And these types of behavior are really prominent among these cultures, and they're typically consistent with the culture. Studies for these are Kashima and Triandis, which wanted to identify the different cultural differences with self-serving bias and the way they would act. So they had Japanese students, as well as students from the United States, and the students were shown 15 slides specifically of certain life in different countries, and then they were given a test. After this, the researchers showed them an additional 5 slides, and then they were given another test, and from this test, they were randomly assigned to 2 specific groups that were called the success group or the failure group. And then after this, they were given a questionnaire about attribution. The success group were told that they passed the exam, and they were success, and these were the American students, and it was found that the students would have self-serving bias, and since they passed, they would say that it was their fault that they passed, and that it was their beliefs that allowed them to pass. Rather than taking credit for the whole group, they took credit for themselves. However, the failure group was the Japanese students, where they actually failed the exam, but they showed modesty bias, saying that the reason that they failed was them blaming themselves. The next study was Musin, Vanderbrink, and Hofstede, and this study was conducted to see the power distance index and if it could produce the differences between the various cultures and the culture that was within these specific countries. And then this study had 10 different European countries, it had doctors, and it had 5,000 subjects. And in this, it wanted to see the changes in the patient-doctor communication. So the researchers had recorded the participants' medical communication that they had with the doctor, And then before this, they had to fill out a questionnaire. And they did this for all the studies, for all the different countries to see the effect. And it was found that there was a high relationship between the country and the culture, as well as the power distance index. And it was found that the countries that had the high power distance index had a tendency to give less information, rather than the countries that had a low index. They were giving the high information about their personal life. And this illustrates how different countries have different cultures, and how different cultures are more likely or less likely to discuss the certain information that's happening. So yeah. The next study would be Bond and Smith, which in this study they looked at to see how much conformity was influenced by the specific culture that an individual had. And in this study, the study was a meta-analysis, which means that there was various studies that were taken in. And then in this study, there was 133 conformity studies that were taking part in 17 different countries. And this meta-analysis found that collectivist cultures, such as Fiji and Hong Kong, had higher rates of conformity than the individualistic countries. And this also pertains to cultures such as individualistic cultures don't conform because they want to have a voice and they want to say their opinions, rather than collectivists want to cherish the group harmony and they want to keep the peace between themselves. So they often don't have these higher rates of conformity because they want to make sure everyone agrees on a specific task before someone would go and be different within the culture. So this kind of shapes overall how cultures in these countries shape the behavior, such as the way they exhibit the bias and the way that they behave, and specifically with